Good evening. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you here and to everyone watching on UW television. Tonight's lecture, Slavery, Antebellum America's National Institution by Professor Stephanie Camp, is the third in our four-part series on slavery and freedom in the making of America, a series of lectures that we've organized to recognize the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Before I introduce Professor Camp, I'd like to also convey a few very important thank yous. First, we must again thank our incredible staff in the Department of History. They have worked tirelessly, literally for a year, to make this series happen. Second, on behalf of the entire History Department, it's my pleasure to express our appreciation for the generous financial support without which this series could not happen. For support of the series and the UW TV broadcast, we are grateful to the Logan Family Endowment, established by Don Logan, a passionate student and teacher of the Civil War. Additional support has come from the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies here at the University of Washington. And finally, we are grateful for the help of Vice President for Minority Affairs and Vice Provost for Diversity, Sheila Edwards-Lang, and Associate Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement, Luis Fraga. Let me say a few words about our format. Professor Camp will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a short 10-minute break. When we come back from the break, Professor Camp will conclude her lecture, and then we'll move directly to a question and answer period. When we have the Q&A, there'll be microphones on these two aisles here, and we'll ask you to go to those microphones if you have questions you'd like to address to Professor Camp. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Stephanie M.H. Camp, the Donald W. Logan Family Endowed Professor in American History here at the University of Washington. And to introduce Stephanie, I'd first like to tell a little anecdote. A few summers ago, I was leading a seminar in England, and one of the participants was a young woman finishing up an MA in slavery studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Now, this woman, being a Brit, knew nothing about United States geography. She had no idea where the state of Washington is. But when I told her that I taught at the University of Washington, her face immediately lit up, and she asked me in a hushed tone, "Do you know Stephanie Camp?" I very calmly, very nonchalantly said, "Of course I know Stephanie Camp. She's one of my close colleagues and friends." And with that, I earned instant credibility with this young scholar who described Stephanie Camp as her idol. Now, there are very clear reasons why any student of American slavery today might describe Professor Stephanie Camp in such glowing terms. Her scholarship has transformed how we understand the enormously important subject of slave resistance in the Antebellum South, and especially how we understand what resistance meant and what it looked like for enslaved women. In her award-winning book, Closer to Freedom, Enslaved Women and Everyday Resistance in the Plantation South, published by the University of North Carolina Press, Professor Camp quite simply undid a half-century or more of previous scholarship that had presumed that resistance was a primarily male domain and a primarily male phenomenon. For her ability to ask the right questions, to tease new insights out of familiar sources, and to bring the worlds of the enslaved to life in some of the most vivid and poetic prose one will ever encounter, Stephanie Camp has garnered a truly international reputation among historians and graduate students of slavery and Southern history as a bold and pioneering scholar. Professor Camp has also co-edited an anthology that grew out of a series of conferences she organized on new studies in the history of American slavery, and she is now deep into the writing of an absolutely fascinating new book whose title is Black is Beautiful, An American History. This is a book that explores the history of debates among and between Blacks, white Americans, and Europeans about whether Black bodies could be beautiful, and uncovers the extent to which claims about Black beauty and Black ugliness have changed dramatically over time. I have no doubt that this book will be as transformative as her first. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Stephanie M.H. Camp.
Good evening. Thanks, Stephanie, for that nice introduction. That was really kind. And thanks to all of you for coming tonight. 2 weeks ago, Professor Sandra Joshua helped us to explore the role that Roman slavery played in the American slaveholding and imagination, as well as how ancient Romans used slavery and slaves to conceptualize freedom. Last week, Professor Stephanie Smallwood sketched for us how, in the English colonies in the Americas, slavery got attached to Africans and their descendants, and also got attached to American understandings of freedom. Tonight, I'm going to pick up on these themes in the context of the 19th century United States. I'm going to argue that slavery was not solely a Southern institution, but very much a national one. In particular, we're going to explore a few themes. The first theme concerns the writing in the 19th century of a new rendition of an old tune, The Problem of Black Difference. American race thought was modernized in the 19th century, and its modernization had everything to do with slavery within the Plantation South as well as north of it. Modern racism did not honor the imagined borders between the sections that would, in 1861, come to define Confederate and Union battle lines. As we'll see, those borders scarcely existed before 1861. Nothing better reveals this fact than the extent to which slavery and slaves powered the economic life of the region north of the Cotton Kingdom. So we will examine the role that slavery played in the creation of American wealth. Banking, manufacturing, construction, taxes, private wealth, and philanthropic giving were all financed by the trade in and ownership of people. Finally, we'll take a moment to consider the relationship between American slavery and American freedom. Slavery afflicted the nation as a whole, infecting its ideas about race and about freedom, and poisonously powering its economic wealth. But first, let's take up the question of how slavery shaped race and racism in and outside of the slave South. 19th century American ideas about race were fairly distinctive from what had come before. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Europeans and white Americans who thought and wrote about human difference tended to think that humanity was composed of what they called varieties or types, and they mapped human types to geographical places. The differences that existed between the world's diverse peoples, observers thought, mainly came from their environment and from cultural practices. Bodies responded to the weather and temperature, to cleanliness, and to habits. Cool weather drew out the copious body hair of Europeans. The sun darkened skin. Historians call this school of thought environmentalism. Now, there was nothing necessarily benign about environmentalism. Human types were typically ranked from most superior, almost always Europeans, to the most inferior, almost always Africans, Negroes, Australia's indigenous people, or Khoisan people of South Africa, depending on who was writing. Racial writers widely believed that Europe's cool temperatures helped explain why Europeans were so admirably hardworking and brave, while on the other hand, Africa's heat explained Africans' passions and passivity. But even with this strong sense of human hierarchy, environmentalism did admit the possibility of change. Change the environment, and human bodies could rise to new challenges or fall into mediocrity. The fact that human bodies were mutable implied that a person could be anything depending on her surroundings and circumstances. For example, a publication by Samuel Stanhope Smith. Smith was a New Jersey minister, a philosophy professor, and from 1795 to 1812, the president of the College of New Jersey, which is known as Princeton University today. In 1787, Smith published a book called Essay on the Causes of Variety of Complexion and Figure in the Human Species. It's one of the earlier examples of American ethnology, and it strongly argued for the capacity of the human body to be shaped and tinted by behavior and the environment. So when Smith wanted to explain the convex, or what he and many others called gibbous, shape of black people, black people's legs in particular, he directed readers to consider the behavior of black and African mothers. He argued that given the warmth of Africa's climates, a mother there was, quote, not under the same necessity to be perpetually solicitous for the safety and subsistence of her infant, nor does she feel the same motives to exercise such constant and minute attentions to preserve the erectness and activity of its person. While occupied in domestic cares, she often leaves even her youngest children for a long time together, wholly to their own management. Children thus left, while their bones are yet in a soft and almost gristly state, will be liable to many accidents that may distort the finger of their limbs. So in addition to the accidents that many toddlers would encounter while their mothers tended to other matters, crawling further pressed, quote, upon the tender bones of the thighs and legs and gave them that gibbous form, which is thought to be peculiar to the African race. While it may have been peculiar to the African race, this gibbous convex shape could nonetheless be shed. He continued, in the United States, they are gradually throwing off this gibbous deformity of the leg. Many of them of the third or fourth descent who have been trained in genteel families and have not been pressed by excessive labors are distinguished by straight and well-turned limbs and by those easy and graceful movements which can never be exhibited where the person is crooked or deformed. And this change is becoming daily more conspicuous. Environmentalism held sway in Europe for much of the 19th century, but its life in the United States was much shorter. It only lasted through the late 18th century. In the US, between the late 18th century and the early 19th, Americans began to think differently about the nature of humanity. More than ever before, Americans conceived of human difference in fundamentally biological terms. Energized by Enlightenment impulses, 19th century American racial writing overwhelmingly adopted a scientific posture, conducting research, collecting data its authors claimed was empirical, writing in the idioms of the sciences. The body's anatomy, physiognomy, biology, its smells and textures were interpreted like emissions of evidence from within the body, like proof of the physical essence of race. Physicians, medical school professors, and amateur scientists searched black bodies through and through, asking, where is race? This line of inquiry was prompted by more, though, than the scientific turn. It was prompted as well by other Enlightenment concepts, those of human equality, the importance of rights, the value of liberty. With all the chatter of rights and liberty in the late 18th century, the American owners of slaves had to ask themselves, why is slavery just? They never asked themselves if slavery was just, that they never doubted. But why, in an age of democratic revolutions, was slavery right? Pro-slavery thought rested on many arguments, but the most important one was that the environmentalists had got it wrong. People couldn't be anything, depending on their circumstances. People could not change, because race was not circumstantial. It transcended geography, and it transcended history. It was biological. So here we have a dramatic turning point, a turn to racist modernity. Human difference had previously been thought of largely as the product of circumstance and the environment, a product of nature, which had been designed by God. But in the 19th century, it was now seen as laying within the human body, and not just any human body. American racial science was preoccupied with the American Negro's body. It was, as Professor Smallwood pointed out last week, a largely binary view of the world that often reduced those who were neither black nor white to intermediary races. What made the Americans different in this regard? The need to defend black slavery, of course, and American racial research found that defense within the black body itself. Compare Samuel Stanhope Smith's careful, but still racist, attention to bodily change over time with the argument set out in the widely read and hugely influential Types of Mankind, published in 1854. Written by the respected racial researchers Josiah Nott and George Glidden, Types of Mankind laid out what Nott and Glidden saw as the purpose of ethnology. The scope of this science, they wrote, was to understand what was the primitive or organic structure of each race, what such race's moral and physical character, how far a race may have been or may become modified by the action of time and moral and physical causes, and what position in the social scale Providence had assigned to each type of man. Underlying these questions about racial character and racial destinies and the possibility of modification was the thesis that there was no possibility for modification. In this work, as in much of 19th century American racial science, character and destiny were permanently linked to the body. The intellectual man is inseparable from the physical man, Nott and Glidden asserted to widespread agreement. The question was, where in the body was race located? American scientists debated this question, searching the Negro's body through and through. Some said they had found it in the bone structure. So if we look here, we can see, of course, we see the classic, sort of like the Negro skull is smaller, the Mongol skull is larger, and then this is the idealized Caucasian skull. And so this is, typical. Over here, we also see a difference in the facial structure, larger jaw, smaller chin. These are said to be sort of, part of the bone structure that distinguished Black people from white people. And also in this image, we can see both that the bone structure reveals a large foot that's turned out and that is slightly bent or gibbous. Some believed that they had located race in the blood. Others said the essence of the Negro was in the voice. Perhaps one of the most enduring ideas was that the most stable and telltale body feature was the hair. Black hair was said to be disappointingly short, far too curly, and, if unkempt, it curled into little knots comparable to nap-upon cloth. European and white hair was idealized in ethnologic literature as long and flowing. Unlike Black people's hair, it had transcended function to achieve ornamental qualities. Long, flowing hair lent beauty, grace, and dignity to Caucasian bodies. It worked with everything else about them to create an overall sense of perfect harmony. Could any of these, quote, sentiments attach to the hair of the Negro? One writer asked rhetorically. Of course not. It was short and functional, existing purely for the, quote, protection of the head. The texture of their hair set Negroes apart, not only from whites, but also from all other races. Some racial scientists even argued that the hair was the most constant, the most palpable feature of the, quote, Negro conformation. Nothing more reveals the distance that American racial scientists believed existed between white and Black people than the ubiquity with which they used the term wool when talking about Black hair. The figure of the Negro did not have, according to them, true hair at all, only wool. The very structure of black hair was unlike the white man's. It was not tubular, but it was flat with scales on its exterior, like sheep's wool, wrote Samuel Cartwright. Cartwright was a Louisiana physician who specialized in the medical treatment of slaves, and he regularly published his observations and theories about black physiology in medical journals. Just like sheep's wool, he said, Negro hair could be shorn, spun, knit, and felted, hardly the qualities of true human hair. For the widely read French racist Julien Joseph Viry, excellent proof of the permanence of black difference was, he said, the woolly hair of the Negroes. It constituted what he called an essential characteristic, and by that he meant that it was an unchanging and defining characteristic. This kind of sharp attention to distorted body features was visible in everyday American life. In print culture and in the theater, where minstrels performed caricatures of big-footed, loose-limbed, large-rumped Negroes, these were displayed everywhere when free black complained. Beyond the medical and scientific literature that shaped expert opinion on human races, there were the countless, quote, woodcuts and placards descriptive of the Negro's deformity, he reported. On display in newspapers, in bookshops, in shop windows, in pubs all over the country and in Europe, prints and placards educated ordinary people about how to interpret what they saw when they encountered black people. So this illustration on the left by Edward Clay. Edward Clay did a series called on blacks in Philadelphia that was exhibited both in a London gallery and in a Philadelphia gallery. So, you know, there's both a sort of transatlantic aspect to all of this, but also just that these kinds of illustrations were considered amusing and commonplace and ordinary. But let's remember that these ideas were not limited to the popular culture. Indeed, they weren't created by the popular culture. No, for that, we need to look back to the scientific and medical literature of the day. American racial science was public scholarship. Lay biologists, botanists, and other fans of the emerging scientific professions read racial writing as much as fellow racial researchers in Europe and the US read one another. This scholarship was aimed not only at other specialists in the field of racial science, but also at practicing physicians, at medical school professors, and a lay public. And the consensus of American racial science was that black people were biologically different. And not only different, but permanently inferior. Now, what's important about all of this for our conversation tonight is that these ideas were produced largely by scholars in the North, scholars who did their research and taught students at Northern medical schools. Recall that Samuel Stanhope Smith was a Princeton professor, and his essay was published in Philadelphia. So was Types of Mankind. In fact, most of this stuff was published in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York. Of course, some of it was printed in New Orleans and Charleston, but most of it was published far north of New Orleans and Charleston. Its authors were, to be sure, Southern physicians like Cartwright, but most of them were professors and doctors in the North. So just to be clear, the point that I'm trying to make here is actually not exactly what I said at the outset. It's true, as I said at the beginning, that slavery shaped racism in the North. That's true. But I would say that more to the point is actually the fact that much pro-slavery thought originated in the states north of plantation slavery. Modern racist thought was formulated and legitimated in the modernizing North's medical schools and publishing institutions. These were intellectual networks that crisscrossed regions, and much of the intellectual work that was done in defense of slavery was researched, written, and published north of the Cotton Kingdom. Northern pro-slavery intellectual work brings us to another issue: the deep economic networks that connected the colonies and the states, networks that ran on the energy of slave labor. In order to take a closer look at these economic networks, let's expand our conversation about American academics. Scholars in New England and the Mid-Atlantic were instrumental to the invention of the 19th century's idea of biological race. Where there is research, there is money funding that research. So let's follow the money, shall we? The oldest American universities are no different from any other American institution that it may have existed in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. They came into existence within a society tangled up with slavery. Like any other part of American life, universities have slavery woven deep in their fabric. Bear in mind that the United States was a slave society for much longer than it has been a free one, 258 years compared with 148 years. And the oldest American universities were founded, attended, staffed, administered, and funded by slaveholders, slave traders, and the farmers, bankers, insurers, textile mill owners, and workers who depended on bound labor for their livelihoods and their wealth. Whether they were located in the Northeast or the slave South, these schools were no mere witnesses to a world of slavery. They helped to bring that world into existence and were themselves brought into existence by it. Take Brown University, for example. The College of Rhode Island, as it was originally called, was founded in 1764, and many of its early supporters were men enriched by their work trading people. Among these men were the Brown brothers, Nicholas, John, Joseph, and Moses. Indeed, their family was so supportive of the College of Rhode Island that in 1804, the college was renamed Brown after Nicholas's son, Nicholas Jr. The Brown brothers were prominent merchants in Providence who also formed a partnership that they called Nicholas Brown and Company. The company was formed to trade overseas, and it owned a slave trading vessel they called the Sally. Rhode Island was a hub in Atlantic trade in commodities and people that Professor Smallwood talked to us about last week. During the 18th century, about 1,000 slave trading voyages embarked from Rhode Island. These voyages carried over 100,000 Africans into slavery throughout the Americas. So just to take a moment to talk a little bit about the slave trade. So here we see the beginning of that, the beginning of that voyage for the captives who are being rowed aboard these canoes out to a ship where they'll cross the Atlantic. This is a depiction, a watercolor depiction of slaves on board a ship in the hold where they're being, sort of held until they, set sail. And I think this is an interesting image because the people are there sort of intermingled with the barrels of commodities, and they are a commodity, or they were regarded as and treated as a commodity like any other. And then here we see a slave trade inspection taking place in Cuba. We see the seller here watching as a potential buyer inspects a slave in Cuba. And these voyages, these slave trading voyages, employed countless captains, surgeons, and crew. In 1764, the Nicholas Brown Company hired Essex Hopkins to sail the Sally to West Africa in search of slaves. Hopkins was an esteemed veteran officer of the Revolutionary War, a well-regarded Providence ship's captain, and, in future years, a major donor to the College of Rhode Island. The Sally set sail with candles, tobacco, onions, cloth, and rum in her hold. These she would sell. She also carried swivel guns, handcuffs, chains, small arms, cutlasses, and ammunition. Some of these Hopkins might have sold too, but mostly these were for the crew to use to control the human cargo that would be in the Sally's hold on their return. The Brown brothers had tasked Hopkins with selling and buying all of these goods to best advantage, and also with bringing back to Providence, quote, 4 likely young slaves, end quote, for the family's own use. Likely young slaves would have been enslaved young people 15 years old or younger. The voyage was a disaster. Hopkins met a market glutted with rum by other European traders, as well as a scarcity of captives who were, as a result, very expensive. Buying to best advantage was tough to do. The Sally lingered on the coast for 9 long months, slowly accumulating the human property she sought, stowing them on board until Hopkins considered the ship full. Then they headed off for Antigua. Before the Sally even embarked on her return crossing with 196 people that Hopkins had managed to procure, 20 of them were dead. At sea, the Sally weathered a failed insurrection by the captives, retaliation by the crew, and much sickness. By the time she arrived in Antigua, no less than 109 of the 196 captives who had left West Africa were dead. They had been murdered by the crew in retaliation after the insurrection, and they succumbed to disease, starvation, and suicide. At auction, the survivors were so sick and wasted that they sold for 1/10 of the going price for a healthy, prime slave. Even by the standards of the African slave trade in the 18th century, it was a shocking voyage. But in many ways, the Sally was typical of the 1,000 or so slaving voyages that ran out of Rhode Island. This was very risky business, very risky and very profitable. The Sally revealed the risks, the calamitous loss of life, and the potential for financial debacle. Other voyages reaped the enormous profits that became philanthropic gifts that helped found Brown and other elite American universities. So this is a painting that was made in 1758. It's called Sea Captains Carousing in Suriname. Title kind of says it all. This is a group of various Rhode Island sea captains who happened to find themselves in the same place in the Dutch Caribbean colony of Suriname. And so to mark the moment, they commissioned the artist John Greenwood to paint their picture together. So they gathered at a tavern for the occasion. Served by enslaved people, they drank not shots of rum, not goblets of rum, but bowls of rum punch that they passed around to share. Among these men, 6 were future trustees of the College of Rhode Island, including our acquaintance, Essex Hopkins. Now, Brown is probably the most famous case, and it's certainly one of the best documented ones, but it was hardly alone. One ship owner named Israel Thorndike, a man not unlike the man pictured here, had amassed a fortune of $1.5 million by 1803. He contributed a portion of his wealth to Harvard. He funded a number of professorships and donated his collection of rare books to the college library, a collection that today is the largest private collection, a private library system in the world. Likewise, here's Isaac Royal, the son of an Antiguan slaveholder and sugar planter who himself became a plantation owner in Suriname and in Massachusetts. Royal contributed the funds to establish Harvard's first professorship of law. The good news is that today, the Royal Professorship of Law is held by a scholar, a legal scholar who focuses on gay, lesbian, and queer legal studies. These are only a few examples. Over and over this happened. Those who gained from slavery contributed some of their wealth to our earliest professorships, fellowships, and libraries. Just as slave-made money ran into universities, slaves themselves were on campus. Whether we're talking about Brown, Harvard, and Yale in New England, or UNC, the University of Virginia, and the College of William and Mary in the South, slaves were there. They were brought to campus in Cambridge and Providence to serve their masters, just as they were brought to campus in Virginia and North Carolina. Slaves were hired or rented by universities and lent by their owners to help build some of the oldest campus buildings in our country. So here is University Hall, Brown's oldest building. Construction records show that an enslaved man named Perrow helped build it. And you can see that Perrault's owner, Henry Paget, was paid for Perrault's 29 days of work. A native man named Job also worked on this construction, as well as a black man named Mingo, who may have been a free man because he appears to have been paid himself for his own labor. Slaves were gifted to universities just as real estate is donated today, and the proceeds from their sales went into endowments. Just like slaveholders did in the South and in the ancient world, American universities turned people into coin and put them in their pockets. Slaves came to campus with presidents and professors, and they came to campus with students. Slaves cleaned dorm rooms and tended to the fires that kept others warm. They cleaned classrooms, cooked meals, and ran errands while their owners studied and went to class and ran the university. They and their labor were taken for granted during their lives. Consequently, only a few of their names have survived. These two men were named Wilson Caldwell and Eli Merritt. They were what were called college servants. They were not servants, they were slaves, but that was the term at UNC, hired by UNC. At Harvard, there were Brister, Jem, Molly, Cato, Hannibal, Agnes, Prince, Frank, Spaniard, Venus, Titus, Juba. These were just a few of the enslaved people who supported life and learning at Harvard and Brown and UNC and throughout the nation. Enslaved contributions to higher education did not end with their deaths. Our first medical schools in the 18th century used, without consent, the corpses of enslaved people. Slaves' bodies were used in dissection lessons, as model skeletons, as display organs. But the most important story here, though, is not about the great family fortunes that were created for a philanthropic few. No, the story is bigger than that, because it's a story of widespread participation. It's a story not only about the making of an American elite, but of the American economy more broadly. In Rhode Island and elsewhere in New England and the mid-Atlantic, middle-class people bought stock in slave trading voyages, hoping, expecting to realize gain from their share in the slave ship. And let's not forget the many ancillary businesses that supported the trade in people and that were in turn supported by it. The boatwrights who built the ships, the sailmakers, coopers, carpenters, rope makers, and blacksmiths who fitted them out, the caulkers, painters, and carpenters who kept them maintained. Rum distilleries churned out the drink that would be traded for people in West Africa. Coopers made the barrels to hold it in, barrels that had been made from local lumber procured by local lumbermen. New England factories, workshops, and foundries made whale oil candles, cloth, and iron bars, which were valued by West African traders. And then there was the provisioning trade from New England and the mid-Atlantic to the plantation societies to their south. As Professor Smallwood discussed last week, Caribbean slaves were kept so entirely busy growing crops for the market that they were dependent on imports for food. So New England salt cod, onions, and flour fed the enslaved. Caribbean and Southern slaves wore clothes made from Negro cloth, that's what it was called, which was a cheap, rough cloth that told the slaves and told the world just what their place in society was. If they had shoes, and few did, they wore wooden brogans that had been made in the North. At night, they slept under rough, threadbare blankets originating in northern workshops and factories. At work, they pulled cotton into sacks made in northern factories. In the evenings, their owners read books printed in the American North or in Europe by the light of candles made from whale oil in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So the story of slavery in the North, especially in the maritime Northeast, was literally, as one historian has written, the business of the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. And while many of us may have forgotten it until recently, New Englanders knew it at the time. In 1787, a Rhode Island minister who opposed the slave trade chastised his neighbors who, he wrote, have had by far the greatest share of this traffic of all these United States. This trade in the human species has been the first wheel of commerce of Newport, on which every other movement in business has chiefly depended. That town has been built up and flourished in times past at the expense of the poor Africans. And the inhabitants have lived on this and by it have gotten most of their wealth and riches. Now, the northern states abolished slavery between 1780 and 1803. But emancipation in the North did not end the northern entanglement in the institution. And that's because slave-originated money continued to come in through profits made through businesses that might on the surface seem unsullied by slavery, but were in fact profoundly dependent on it. So take the textile industry, for example. With the Industrial Revolution of the American economy in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, came new forms of production and new forms of work. Where human hands working around households had once produced fabrics and shoes and household necessities, machines located in factories now did that work. Throughout the Atlantic network, these factories spun and wove cotton and hemp grown by slaves in the American South. So in the 1850s, cotton from the slave South accounted for 100% of the cotton that was consumed in the United States. Now that might not be all that surprising, but Southern slave-grown cotton was 77% of the cotton consumed in Britain, 90% of that consumed in France, 60% of what was used in Germany, and about 92% of what was consumed in Russia. So we've seen how the ancillary businesses supported the shipping of Africans across the Atlantic for sale in the Americas. And so it was with the many ancillary businesses supported by the processing of slave-grown cotton. The free labor of the Industrial Revolution, its mill workers, machinists, railroad workers, and bankers, all were tangled up with slavery. And that American wealth redounded to American universities. Abbott Lawrence, for example, owned cotton mills in Massachusetts and got very rich. In the late 1840s, he made 2 gifts to Harvard that allowed the university to establish the Lawrence Scientific School, which today is called the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. Okay, but the point is not, or my point is not to malign Abbott Lawrence or Isaac Royal or Isaac Hopkins or the Brown brothers. Indeed, one of the Brown brothers became a devout abolitionist and helped to found Rhode Island's first anti-slavery society. You guessed it, it was Moses. Part of Moses' strategy to battle slavery was to promote local manufacturing. He expected that success in local manufacturing would help to convert the moneyed men of Newport, and especially the guinea traders who disgracefully continue in the beaten track of that inhuman traffic. He thought that he could entice them into manufacturing and to leave the slave trade behind. His peers were skeptical. An Ethiopian could as soon change his skin as a Newport merchant could be induced to change so lucrative a trade for the slow profits of any manufactory, one warned. Moses' own brother, John Brown, in 1789 made another critique, one that posed an even deeper challenge to Moses' idea. I hope the Abolition Society will promote our own manufactories, especially the cotton manufactory, for which great experience has accrued and is accruing. This is most certainly a laudable undertaking and ought to be encouraged by all. But pause a moment. Will it do to import cotton? It is all raised from the labor of our own blood. The slaves do the work. I can recollect no one place at present from whence the cotton can come, but from the labor of the slaves. Now, there is nothing attractive here about John's gleeful smugness, but the man made a point. Slavery was America's economic lifeblood. Slaves may have been less visible in the North, but their labor was no less crucial to manufacturing than it was to plantation agriculture in the South. Underneath the 19th century's landscape of manufacturing and the exchange of money and free labor lay the toil and the groans of the enslaved. The ensnarement tugs us deeper still. In order for cotton planters to grow all that cotton, they needed farming supplies, and they wanted slaves. Like businesses of all kinds, they needed credit to get them from one crop to the next, from one harvest to the next. There were certainly local and regional banks that provided these kinds of agricultural loans, but Boston and New York banks had a big piece of this business as well. They sold mortgages to landowners with which to buy slaves. Banks accepted slaves as collateral on loans. Among others, the bank that became J.P. Morgan Chase has a history of having done this. Insurance companies insured slave traders and slave owners against possible losses. The insurance company Aetna did this, provided Negro insurance. The men who grew prosperous in banking and insurance, in turn, made philanthropic gifts to universities and sent their children to them, ensuring generations of loyalty and, perhaps, gift-giving. The turn of the century was a crucial moment in the history of elite American education. Thanks to donor generosity, schools that had started as precious but provincial training institutes for ministers grew into the enormously wealthy and influential universities that they are today. For example, Harvard's endowment, which had not been particularly notable in the 18th century, far outstripped its peers by 1850. By 1850, Harvard's endowment was 3 times Yale's and 5 times that of Amherst and Williams combined. Much of this wealth was gained through private donations from men who profited in one way or another from the exploitation of enslaved people. Indeed, between 1800 and 1850, half of all of the donations made to Harvard came from 25 major donors, men who directly or indirectly were enriched by slavery. Their gifts funded professorships and library purchases, building construction, and the establishment of schools. And these privileges only compounded over time. Even the abolition of the African slave trade in the US in 1808 did not end the cycle of wealth accumulation through the trade in people, because some American traders continued their business illegally. And the smugglers of slaves, too, became important donors to schools like Harvard and Brown. Now, I've given special attention to universities, but they are really only a case study. In fact, slavery infected many other American institutions. Taxes on slave imports, on rum distilleries, and on other profits paid for roads in New England. The profits from all of these enterprises were turned into capital that built railroads into the West and developed northern cities. Indeed, railroad companies such as CSX laid and maintained some of their original railroad tracks with slave labor. Mainstream northern newspapers accepted advertisements for runaway slaves, and that helped to keep the newspapers going, because as we all know, they're dependent on advertising revenue. This was something black newspapers refused to do, understandably, and therefore most black newspapers are very, very short-lived in the 19th century. It's just like one abolitionist white woman wrote in 1811, though the New England states have not been deeply stained with the guilt of the slave trade, yet we are not wholly free. And as we are confederated with the southern states, where slavery abounds, we, as a part of the nation, must feel ourselves very guilty on that account. We are not wholly free. It's an interesting choice of words. Within the story of American slavery is not only the part of the story of American wealth, but also the story of American freedom. Why don't we take a brief 5-minute break, stretch our legs, and then when we come back, I'd like to pick up the thread that Professors Joshua and Smallwood began to spin and briefly discuss how slavery shaped American freedom. The relationship between slavery and freedom in American history was as robust as the relationship between slavery and free labor, but it was far more paradoxical. Travelers to the North American colonies in the late 18th century noticed this strange relationship. How is it, the British essayist and traveler Samuel Johnson famously asked, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? How indeed? The answer to this riddle, as Professor Joshua pointed out in her lecture, is that in a slave society, people think with slaves. Or, as Professor Smallwood put it last week, Americans thought freedom through slavery. So during the Revolutionary era, it wasn't the case that American patriots wanted their freedom from the tyranny of British governance and taxation, despite denying freedom to enslaved people. It's that what freedom meant to them was defined by slavery and slaves. In the late 18th century, American patriots agitated to free themselves from the debasement and alienation of unrepresentative government, from the tyranny of a king, and from the shackles of burdensome taxation. And they did so with a political vocabulary infused with slavery. For example, in 1764, the governor of Rhode Island, Stephen Hopkins, a slaveholder, published an influential pamphlet called Rights of the Colonies Examined. His position here became an American political orthodoxy. Liberty is the greatest blessing that men enjoy, and slavery is the heaviest curse that human nature can be capable of. Those who are governed at the will of another and whose property may be taken from them without their consent are in the miserable condition of slaves. These are key words that would be heard again and again in taverns and in the streets during the years of the Revolution: consent and tyranny, property and representation, slavery and liberty. It's a habit of mind that has abided. To this day, American political talk remains steeped in the language and logic of slavery. If and when rights are violated or perceived to be violated, many of us can only conceive of the denial of those rights as a loss of freedom, which can only be a form of enslavement. Those who are governed at the will of another without their consent are in the miserable condition of slaves. It wasn't just a rhetorical habit of mind in the 18th century. The fact was, patriots worried that British taxation on slave-made goods would injure their slave-based economy. Worried about the effect taxes would have on the provisioning trade, one Rhode Island protest pamphlet said in 1776, I got ahead of myself here. Let me pause, let me interrupt myself. So this image here is obviously a series of photographs of Tea Party protests of the Obamacare, and also select screenshots from websites. And here we have a pretty notorious campaign from People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, in which they compared circuses, the treatment of elephants in circuses, to human slavery, to black slavery. And I just note parenthetically that PETA is kind of notorious for coming up with these very provocative campaigns, and it's very interesting that they use these kind of master metaphors, or what in the West are kind of master metaphors. One of the other campaigns that they got in a lot of trouble for was of course the Holocaust on Your Plate, in which they compared the treatment of pigs for food production to the Holocaust. So PETA likes to kind of draw on these master metaphors to basically make us try and feel for animals. All right, but to return to the point. So this was the protest pamphlet published in 1776 in Rhode Island, and referring to the provisioning trade and taxation on the provisioning trade. And they said, without this trade, it would have been and will always be utterly impossible for the inhabitants of this colony to subsist themselves. As we've seen, these words speak to the centrality of slavery in the New England economy, but they do more than that. They highlight the great paradox of American history, that with the same breath, patriots and slaveholders defended the ideals of liberty and equality and the right to own people. Indeed, the right to own some people was a form of freedom for other people. American freedom was grounded in trade and in property ownership, even when that property was a person. American slavery and American freedom, then, were tangled up both rhetorically and materially. This evening, I've argued that slavery was not just a Southern peculiarity. Its economic and intellectual pressures did not honor the imagined border between the North and the South. Instead, slavery was woven deep into the fabric of American life. Specifically, it was an animating force in the making of American ideas about race, our wealth as a nation, and our obsession with freedom. The symbiosis of slavery and freedom and with the life of our nation has been cast in stone, pretty much literally. Take a look at the Capitol building. Between 1792 and 1800, 650 workers worked on the construction of the Temple of Liberty, as it was called originally. 400 of them were enslaved. They were enslaved carpenters and masons whose owners were paid $5 a month for their labor. When their work was done, the men were sold to the West Indies. Atop the Temple of Liberty is a 19-foot tall statue called Freedom. Philip Reed was an enslaved man when he worked in the early 1860s in this foundry right here with a number of free white workers to cast Freedom and hoist her atop the Temple of Liberty. Reed's story ended a little bit more happily, in fact, much more happily than those of the hundreds of enslaved workers who worked on the building, the Capitol building, and then were sold. He became a free man in 1862 when Abraham Lincoln declared a limited emancipation within the District of Columbia. In the 1930s, the federal government sent out WPA workers to interview people who had been enslaved only a handful of decades before. One of those people was a South Carolinian named Cornelius Holmes. And I can think of no better words to leave you with than those he offered as he reflected on what had changed since emancipation and what had not. He said, "Though the slave question is settled, the race question will always be with us. It's in our politics, in our justice courts, on our highways, on our sidewalks, in our manners, in our religion, in our thoughts, all the day and every day." Thank you. So I welcome questions and comments. I think, did they set up microphones? They want microphones? Yes, so could you use the microphone right there? Because that way they can pick it up. And also everyone can hear.
Okay, my question is, it's in your research and in your work, how much of law and religion have you seen as a part of the making of the whole the slavery institution, and remnants of the continued elements that slavery produced today?
So is the question, what was the role, what were the
Yeah,
roles
what
of the
was
law
role
and
of
religion?
Law and policy, and law and religion. And what makes me ask that question is reading a book, Shades of Freedom by Higginbotham, and then also reading the Re-enslavement, the book by Douglas Blackman, and then Michelle Alexander's book. And I started to ask myself, okay, well, how does law really, impact? How did it help to establish slavery? How did it help to maintain slavery? And then what elements did religion play, or how did religion play into that as well to help maintain or to establish and maintain slavery? And then how did that continue on all the way up until the post-civil rights era, the Jim Crow era, into the Jim Jim Crow era, because Michelle Alexander's book is pretty, I mean, it's pretty bold. She's basically saying that Jim Crow hasn't left us. We have Jim Crow. It's a new form of Jim Crow, but it's still here, and I happen to agree. So I'm wondering how that, in your research, what you found there as far as law.
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. There's, certainly Higginbotham's work and the work of other legal scholars has, really chronicled very carefully how the law legislated slavery, how it, to build on what Professor Small was talking about last week, how on the one hand it created race, how there are literally laws in place that were building blocks to creating race and racial slavery, laws that were both, at the state level that guided not only black behavior and limited slaves' behavior, which of course it did, both slaves and free blacks' behavior and what they were allowed to do and things like that, but also regulated whites' relationships to blacks. And so blacks were forbidden to learn to read, but whites were also forbidden to teach them, and so on and so forth. And so what you see in the law is, a regulation not only and limitation not only of black rights and black lives, but also regulation of relationships and life between and social interaction between black and white. And so really, again, it's kind of coming back to the point that I'm trying to make, which is that everybody was caught up in all of this. So slave law, governed, not just slaves, but those who interacted with them. I guess it's a piece of what I would say in response to your question, which is a very big question and good one, but that's a piece of it.
I was trying to figure out how to actually frame the question so that it wouldn't be so large, so broad, so big, and I wanted to be able to get the question, put that question out there, because in Higginbotham's work he refers to a case, the Davis case in 1630, and which blacks or Africans, when they came here in 1619, they were pretty much free. They still had rights. They were just like any other white indentured servant. And it was over time that they sort of developed, but law had a lot to do with shaping how we started to think of Africans differently than we thought of whites as indentured servants, and then the making of the slavery, and how the reference in the Davis case is very much, and religion is very much involved there, because, Africans were able to actually get away or to have the regular privileges of every other person if they accepted baptism or Christianity.
Yeah, well, and this is going back to what Professor Small was talking about last week, because I think that the Davis case, the Hugh Davis case, and also the Sweat case, I'm blanking on the first name, but what they both show in the 1630s and 1640s is, I would argue with you a little bit in the sense that I think that it's true that, it's not as though it was clear in the 1630s and 40s what being an African in Virginia, meant. It's not, it's not the kind of status that you have in, 1840, where it's, the likelihood is that you're enslaved, certainly in Virginia, very, very likely. And that is lifelong. I mean, although there is a lot that had yet to be sorted out in 1630 and the 1630s and 40s. But both the Davis case and a later case, the Sweat case, also show, they both reveal that Africans weren't exactly just like anyone else, because, in the Davis case, he is punished for defiling his body by lying with a Negro. And he's punished not any differently than anyone else would have been punished for fornication, but the language of that case does say that he is defiling his body. So that's different. And then the Sweat case, he actually is, the white man is punished differently for having sort of fornicated with a Negro. He's punished differently than other cases of fornication. So you can kind of see this incremental sort of like, okay, there's a difference. Okay, there's more of a difference, and then we get to some of the cases that Professor Small was talking about in the 1660s, where the differences are seen as greater, and certainly they're legally bound to slavery. So, yeah. Yes.
So yeah, thank you very much. That was very, very educational. So what I'd like you to do is, can you expand a little bit on your second hypothesis, and that's the hypothesis that the prosperity of the northern colonies in America and probably the prosperity of much of the rest of the world really was kind of corrupted by slavery going on in the slave colonies of the South. And you've done a great job of illustrating that with a handful of writings by very wealthy slave owners who displayed some pretty shameful hypocrisy. 2020 hindsight, it looks like hypocrisy now, of course. But I'm just wondering, could you expand on that and give some examples? Are there writings of the common man in the northern colonies, the non-slave colonies, not prosperous slaveholders, but did the rest of the common people in the North really comprehend that there was this hypocrisy going on? And the same question about Europe. Did Europeans understand that this wonderful cheap cotton they were getting from the colonies was in fact, corrupted and vilified by slaves? So could you explain with the
Sure.
thoughts of the common man?
Well, I don't know about common man, but I mean, there were certainly plenty of people in Europe and in the United States who, well, plenty is perhaps an exaggeration, but certainly they were numerous enough, who saw the hypocrisy, saw the contradictions, at the level of, if you want to say common man, certainly runaway slaves, were very clear about the relationships, and Frederick Douglass is a great example of someone who was, quite prolific in his writings and condemnation of the contradictions around American Christianity and freedom and, the discourse of the Revolution and all of that, and slavery. So that's one common man, who is, of course, an extraordinarily uncommon man. But beyond people like him, I mean, there was, of course, the abolitionist movement in the 19th century that made a very clear critique that saw, many of these points that would have articulated it very clearly. And those were, they weren't, necessarily elites. They were very middle-class people. What workers thought is harder to get at. That is harder in general to get at. Again, and that's in some ways, I mean, that's a different angle on what makes slave narrative so special, is that, that we do have, sort of a couple of scores of these slave narratives where people who otherwise, they're of a class and of a race that are otherwise, silent. But yeah, so the common man, I think, is harder to get at. But it's not as though this is an elite conversation alone at all.
My question has to do with the rapid evolution of society during this time, say from 1750 to 1850. I don't think you could characterize any 20 years apart as being, you take any one point and you can say very significant differences between the North and the South compared to 20 years before and 20 years after. So when you're trying to characterize this relationship of slavery to our freedom, it's so constantly evolving. I have a little trouble how you're going to characterize it definitively.
I guess I don't totally understand what you're asking.
I'm saying if you want to draw conclusions, it becomes very difficult to draw a conclusion if that only applies to a very narrow band of time, because the process, as the South is evolving from a tobacco slavery to cotton slavery, the nation is evolving from a colony to a nation, the North is evolving from a farming society to a manufacturing society, abolition is going from a radical idea to a common idea.
I mean, I guess the only thing I can say is that, the point is that these, that there were important connections here. There are networks of connections, intellectual connections, economic connections, social connections, that, existed between what we imagine to be the South and the North. And, and one thing I didn't have the chance to talk about, but which is also true, which connected what we think of as two distinct regions, were all these sort of family relationships, and part of going to school is like forming friendships and potentially meeting partners. And there's a lot of back and forth. There's certainly a lot of Southerners going to elite Northern universities, and so there's just a lot of intermingling. And so the point I'm simply trying to make is that the kind of sectionalism that we sort of write backwards from 1861 doesn't totally apply. And it's not wholly a fiction, but I think it's overdrawn.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the lecture, Dr. Camp. Can you comment on how both representations of and relations with indigenous peoples in the U.S. during the 19th century and late 18th century complicated views of race in the U.S.
Yeah,
as well?
absolutely. So one of the interesting things is that Types of Mankind, the text that I was talking about in 1854 by Knott and Glidden, was dedicated to Samuel Morton. Glidden was an informal student of Morton. Morton had been his advisor, or mentor, I should say. Samuel Morton was an anthropology professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was a very influential racial scientist who was very, very, very fascinated with American Indians, much more so than like any other race, and collected hundreds. He prided himself on having the largest collection of native skulls in the world. No way of knowing if that's true. But he was absolutely fascinated with Native Americans. In that regard, Morton was somewhat unusual for American racial scientists. Because like I was saying, if you look at, like, European racial scientists are more interested in global peoples, so they'll talk more about nations and types and things like that, somewhat less about races, although not entirely, that concept is of course not absent. But they are more interested in a variety of global types. And the Americans, again, not exclusively, but there is a preponderance. I mean, they don't all share Samuel Morton's fascination or even interest in American Indians or any other global peoples. They are very distracted by the problem of the Negro, which is, sort of one of the many critiques that we could make of their science. I mean, they pride themselves on being, empiricists and, data collectors and this sort of thing. But, the reality is that they were incredibly, their data has been analyzed by, contemporary scholars, and, just a basic data entry is flawed and wrong, to say nothing of the obvious ideological, motivations guiding their work, and then of course the fact that they are so distracted by certain peoples more than others and certain problems more than others.
Hello. I'm a social worker, and I have a little girl that's on my case, and she's 7 years old, and she's an African-American little girl, and she has a friend that's at school, but she doesn't play with that friend at school because she's white and she's African American, but they do live in the same building. And the little girl had told me that she can't wait to get home to play with her friend. They are really good friends. She's the teacher, and the other little girl is always the bus driver, and they take boxes and they paint them with yellow and they play together. And so that was sitting with me today, and then reading what you have with Cornelius Holmes. And I just have sort of a futuristic question to ask you. Now we're looking back at the past, and we find hypocrisy. What do you think that looking back from here and then looking back, what would we find as hypocrisy?
Oh, you're walking away from the microphone. I was gonna throw that back at you. Do you have an idea?
I'm sorry.
Do you have an idea?
Do I have an idea what we would look
Do you
back?
have a thesis you'd like to offer? Or I mean, are you asking that with an idea in mind?
Yeah, what would you have in mind what we would look back as hypocrisy? We're here to hear you.
What did you say?
We're here to hear you and your thoughts.
Yeah. That's a tough one. You know, for historians, we like to look backwards. So looking forward is always hard. You know, I think our moment is, I don't know if it's hypocrisy so much as I think there are, you know, profound contradictions, you know, in terms of having a black president and, you know, Cory Booker and, you know, first black senator from New Jersey and now Bill de Blasio with his black family or racially mixed family. You know, I think there are all these like wonderfully, you know, beautiful things going on in our country as far as, you know, particularly the black-white, you know, conflict or tension. But on the other hand, you know, we have really entrenched problems around poverty and education that it seems we really, really do not make progress on. And I don't know that, maybe it's hypocrisy, maybe there's a hypocrisy that I'm not seeing now or that we don't see now. But I do think that there's a really deep contradiction between so much progress and for some, and yet really a real stuckness and immobility for many, 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 many others.
Thank you.
I'm not sure where we are on time.
So this is a question that's a little bit maybe the next question that would come out of this, which is you make the argument that established universities like Brown, Harvard, Princeton were more or less you know, poisoned by the economic relationships that were going on with slavery. The question I have is how does that compare to, say, the rise of more abolitionist universities that tend to support, it seems like those universities were not necessarily tied to the economic slave trade, and that may be a reason why the rise of the abolition movement, you know, occurred, is because you had, you know, different communities which were more or less an academic competition with these more established universities. It's a general question, you know.
Right. You mean like a school like Oberlin or something?
Like Oberlin and Tufts and a few other, you know,
Yeah.
which would be not necessarily as well endowed, not necessarily tied to the old money, more or less.
Yeah. But I think the problem for them is, for those schools is, and for abolitionists, you know, in the 19th century, British and American, is that, you know, many of them were, you know, those who were wealthy were often, you know, industrialists. Those who were middle class were, you know, professionals. Those who were workers. I mean, I guess my point is that I'm not sure how they could have not been connected somehow to slavery. I don't know where, you know, in what part of the economy they would have been tapping into that would have been free of it.
Yeah,
I
I think my question is more of, do we see the rise of the abolitionists because they're not tied to the slave economy? Do you see, you know, a lot of the anti-abolitionists comes out of the, you know, the farming communities in Minnesota and Ohio and the like, which are not tied to the slave trade. You know, they tend not to need to have the slave trade.
Sure.
You get higher literacy rates among people that are farmers. And is that maybe the reason why you see the rise of the abolitionists, sure, to counteract this intellectual, you know,
Yeah.
old school, you know.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I mean, abolitionism, you know, emerges first in Pennsylvania and then it kind of, you know, sort of goes through the whole mid-Atlantic and New England. And it was, you're right, precisely because they had slaves and they had slavery, but to go back to the distinction that Sandra Joshua made in the first lecture, they were societies with slaves. You know, they were not slave societies like the American South was. They were not, their economies weren't fundamentally, and certainly not directly and explicitly dependent on slaves. And so they were able to move toward gradual emancipation between, in the last decades of the 18th century. But yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, they were able to do that because they were not, you know, mired in it the way that the Plantation South was.
Has there been any studies that look at literacy rates between the North and the South in terms of how they perceive slavery? Because, I mean, I'm kind of wondering whether or not, places like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, which had maybe higher literacy rates, were more anti-slavery than the Deep South, which may have had lower literacy rates. It's just a general question.
I don't know if there are any studies about that. I think it's an interesting question.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think the other issue that your question raises is the role of, print culture in promoting, abolitionism. And that, that is a relationship that was, quite vibrant, that abolitionists made great use of this growing print culture in the U.S., that print culture in turn fueled abolitionism. So I think you're right, I think your instinct there is right, that there's something about this growing reading public that goes in connection, sort of grows in tandem with abolitionism. Now, what I do want to also emphasize, however, is that, and the point was made, I'm not sure if it was Professor Joshua or Professor Smallwood, but, abolitionists are a tiny minority of the Northern, public. It's not as though this is a mainstream movement at all. I mean, they're really the equivalent of like anarchists or something are today. I mean, they were a small group and they were viewed as pretty marginal. So print culture, that was one of the things that allowed them to have a sort of outsized influence on American culture, because they were small, but they could, really kind of get their point of view and the sufferings of the slave, sort of out there for people to see and consider.
There was a notion that was like the 1850s and things, that people were saying that the slavery system was an economic dead end, that the North had been able to rid itself. And I've always rejected that notion, but I'm curious, because the South was a slave society, that's always my argument, that that it was not about to die, that the Civil War was necessary. I was curious what your thoughts are.
I had actually a hard time hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Basically, the question is, was the Civil War necessary? People
Was the Civil War
necessary? People have made the claim that slavery was dying as an economic model. And you're saying that as a slave society, a society with slavery is different than a slave society, and obviously we had this bifurcation between
Right.
the North and the South.
Yeah.
So,
No, I mean, I think for that, like, Abraham Lincoln's view was that, yeah, slavery was dying, but even he thought it was going to die out like in 100 years. So it was not actively dying in the 1860s, it was actively living in the 1860s. It was doing just fine. I do think that, there was this, there were two systems that were interdependent and yet irreconcilable. And I think that's another great contradiction of that moment, was that you did have certainly ideologically, two very different. I mean, I do think the Civil War was necessary. Yes, yeah. I think certainly many abolitionists at the time came to consider it inevitable. I'm not sure about time. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to establish what time it is. 8:37. Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Hi, Professor Camp. Thank you for the lecture. It was very nice. My name is Jacqueline Wu, and I'm actually a student of Professor Joshua right now. And currently, we finished reading Johnson's piece, Soul by Soul. And during that piece, he commented that the identity of a Southern white man's honor is dependent on slaves. So I'm wondering out of curiosity, what is the identity of a white man from the North? And overall, what is the identity of, I guess, probably white Americans during that time? And how's their relationship with slavery besides, I guess, the idea of their notion of freedom and how it's constructed upon? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because that's right. Certainly, Southern honor depended on slaves and slavery, men and women's Southern honor. And a number of people have written, from W.E. Du Bois to, in the early 20th century, to David Roediger in the 1990s, have argued that one of the things that sort of all whites, North and South, got out of slavery, gained was a form of honor called whiteness, and that they all shared. And that part of what happened with European immigrants coming into the country was that they became white, and that took time, because as we all know, the Irish and the Italians and so on and so forth were sort of maligned and disrespected as they arrived. But what they were able to do was to align themselves with whites as part of a white community, and they did that by distancing themselves from blacks because they weren't slaves. And so there is a kind of honor that came with freedom, for all whites. Yeah. We'll take one or two more questions.
Can I slip in one more question? Do you have time for one more?
Yeah, we have time
Okay.
for about two more.
Well, thank you for the lecture. It was wonderful. And there's brought up a whole lot of different thoughts and ideas, but I'll try to concentrate on one issue and one law, which I'm not sure, it's a little bit later down the pike than what the time period you're talking about, but the issue was the Fugitive Slave Act. Mm-hmm. And the turning point in public opinion around slavery at that point,
Right.
mainly because it put whites at risk, and that whites were being prosecuted for not doing things. And there was a lot of parallel between what the Arizona laws around immigration or illegals are that they passed, and what the Fugitive Slave Act was. And it seems that the Arizona modeled themselves after the Fugitive Slave Act. But what they were really, the point that I'm trying to ask is, was that a dividing point? Is that a place where you can see where everything kind of shifted because whites all of a sudden were being attacked and imprisoned for supporting free blacks or protecting free blacks and things like that?
Absolutely, it's a turning point. So this is an 1850 law that allowed slaveholders to send, agents to the north to collect anybody they claimed was a runaway slave from their plantation. It was widely abused to basically, seize free black people and sell them into slavery. And it required Northerners basically you could deputize, a police officer could deputize any ordinary citizen and say, you, help me. And it was against the law for you to not help. And so it put white Northerners at risk, but it was also viewed, this is the 1850s and after the Fugitive Slave Laws, when you start hearing, or Fugitive Slave Act, is when you really start hearing white Northerners talk a lot about the slaveocracy. And that was the idea, that had to do with slaveholders' power. That here they are reaching out, of the confines of their plantation fiefdoms, where they were all powerful, and extending that power into northern cities and states where people, had decided to gradually manumit their slaves, had decided to pass, local laws that were helping runaway slaves, had their abolitionist societies. Again, most Northerners were not participating in this, but they were respecting the rights they certainly respected the integrity of their own states and of the emancipation of slaves in the North. And yet here comes the power of the slaveholder, the slaveocracy. And so I think it has as much to do with the power of slaveholders, the overreach, as it does with the risk that it put whites at, because it wasn't that much of, it wasn't that threatening. It was seen really more as an act of incredible overreach and hubris.
But it was great publicity for the abolitionists.
Yeah,
Whites were actually being
totally.
dragged into courts and sent to prison for refusing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it was a turning point for white abolitionists. It was a turning point for black abolitionists. Many who had theretofore been committed to sort of political debate in the attempt to sort of, through narratives like the 12 Years a Slave, the movie, which is out now. So through narratives like that to make people feel the pain of the slave and change their minds about slavery, and that kind of moral and political conversion. A lot of black abolitionists after 1850, after that law, said that's not going to work. And that's part of why I was saying that for many abolitionists, they really came to see the Civil War as necessary and as inevitable, precisely because there was a turn to a much more radical and much more even militant stance, and a desire for an armed intervention into this problem, which of course it was not exactly what the Civil War began as, but it did end up that way.
So you referenced how slaves sort of underlay the college systems in both the North and the South. And in my own research, I've looked at basically college rule books, which forbid students from doing things like chasing slaves across campus. And I also encountered the situation how on the verge of the outbreak of the Civil War, redundant, but whatever, that the northern-born chancellor of the University of Mississippi's slave, Jane, was raped by a college student. And I wonder, do you see a connection really between sort of student brutality to slaves, college slaves, and sort of this initiation into 19th century ideas of racism and race?
Absolutely. I think that's true of college students who were being socialized at college. I think that's true of anybody who managed a slave, whether they owned that person or was their overseer, was a child, being raised in that context, in the context of the slave plantation. They're being deeply socialized into a relationship to slaves, a violent nature, and a sense of themselves as masters. And I think whether that's happening on a college campus, Southern Plantation, townhouse in Philadelphia, it's a very similar socialization.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.